Hello, welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian, and today I will be speaking with Nerses Kopalyan, the author of our monthly security briefings, as we do every month. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Thank you for having me, Maria.
We're kind of late in the game this month. We're going to be talking about the April security briefing called Azerbaijan's Coercive Credibility, the Contours of a Threat Matrix. And as always, Nerses, you introduce new concepts based on research and scholarship on Armenia's current situation. And, we've been having this ongoing discussion, this continuous discourse in the country about the threats that we face. And we all know the dire security situation in Armenia. At this point, it's stating the obvious. In order to understand these threats, in order to understand how Baku and President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, deals with these threats and how when he acts upon them and when he doesn't. We have to try to understand this. It has to be based on some kind of scholarship. We have so many pundits and so many political scientists and ordinary people, like myself, talking about this all the time. And sometimes I feel like we talk about it in a vacuum without really understanding the depth and the nuances involved. You talk about this course of credibility, right? Where Armenia is the deterring side, where it's doing everything to deter Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is the side that's not only the antagonistic side, but is also carrying on with its threats while pretending that it's deterring Armenian revanchism, if you will. You talk about a number of variables in understanding Aliyev's threats against Armenia. What I want to understand is what are the factors that are central to gauging coercive credibility? And within this context, the method in which the actor justifies its threats also remains crucial to qualifying threat credibility. So you talked, as I said, about four factors. The first one is the specificity of a threat. What do you mean by this?
Thank you, Maria, for that, for sort of, providing a good conceptualization of coercive credibility. So, threat specificity is part of sort of one of the variables that allows us to understand coercive credibility, right? So, before I jump into that really quick, right? So, coercive credibility primarily concentrates on the importance of how the content of threats are constructed and the extent to which this shapes the degree and magnitude of threat credibility, right? So in order for us to understand, for example, Aliyev makes a threat, or Azerbaijan's foreign ministry makes a threat, or Azerbaijan's defense ministry makes a threat, right? What is the level and magnitude with respect to the credibility of that threat? And based on risk propensity, to what extent can we anticipate those threats being basically implemented into action, or to what extent they do not lead to action, but maybe accumulation of more threat, which should eventually lead to action. So this is the magnitude and nuance that we're talking about. And one of the variables that allows us to understand these approaches from an aggressive, an antagonistic actor who tries to engage in what we call compellence, right? To force Armenia to engage in a certain behavior. One of them is threat specificity. And the threat specificity tries to delineate the consequences that will occur if the target, right, in this case Armenia, does not acquiesce to the coercers, Azerbaijan's demands, right? So one way to gauge this within the threat metric is to pay attention whether a threat is vague or specific. And a large body of research shows that the degree of specificity is conducive to credibility, while the degree of vagueness diminishes credibility, right? So if we look at, for example, Aliyev's demeanor, and in last month's report, I write about this, when, for example, Aliyev specifically said, prior to the ethnic cleansing and invasion of Artsakh, when he specifically said, if the Artsakh government engages in elections, electing a president, I will attack. That is a very specific threat. That means that threat has immense credibility of being implemented within the threat matrix. But for example, when he says Armenia must give a Zangis recorder, and then he says, I just came up with that concept on top of my head. Or he says, Western Azerbaijan is Armenia. These are very vague. It doesn't mean there is no threat component into it, but the lack of specificity allows us to be able to gauge the modality of action or level of threat and pending violence that could be anticipated.
Okay, but let me
So,
just stop you
yeah,
there for a second, Nerses. I can understand the whole Western Azerbaijan narrative or discourse because it borders on the absurd. Zangezur corridor, how is that vague when in the November 9, 2020 trilateral statement that ended the 2020 war, there is a statement about providing a road,
a
right?
route, right.
A route from Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhichevan under the FSB, under Russian border guards. How is that vague?
Because when we look at the continuum, right, again, we're talking about here scope and magnitude. So, for example, when we spoke about the specific case of him threatening Artsakh, that is a very specific threat. Western Azerbaijan claims are a more vague threat. So the Zangezur corridor is not as vague as Western Azerbaijan, but it's also not as specific as the threat, for example, he made against the Artsakh leadership. So this is a question of magnitude. So in that context, for example, if he said, if he already made the claim that if Armenia, for example, does not do X, Y, and Z, and a Zangezur corridor, as he demands it, is not secured, then he would use force. That is a specific threat. But to speak in vague terms, saying, well, Armenia has an obligation, we're demanding it. If Armenia keeps this up, something might happen, right? That is the magnitude of vagueness we're talking about. We're not saying the threat isn't there. It's a question of the scope and specificity of the threat, right? And how we qualify its credibility with respect to him taking action. So on the Zangezur issue, right, the so-called Zangezur issue, the more we see him make specific comments, that's where we could qualify the threat credibility increasing and the risk propensity increasing. That's what I meant by the qualification of its vagueness.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to 2022 September when Azerbaijani forces invaded basically Armenia proper in
Mhm.
Jermuk. If we look back, can we see specificity of a threat?
In the Jermuk invasion, Azerbaijan did not utilize specificity because they want to maintain the element of surprise. So, in that context, right, if we had qualified, for example, the body of threats from the Sevlich incursion, from the Rapan attack prior to that, leading to the Jermuk invasion, we're not talking about a singular threat, right? This is a nuanced, complex approach. But if you had quantified the modality of language, if we had systemic content analysis on threat specificity and its causal or correlated relationship with action, then we could have, for example, understood the pending attack on Jermuk. So when we talk about threat specificity, we're not simply talking about they declare it and then they do it. That is too simple. But what we need to understand is if Aliyev, for example, has had no compunctions about invading Armenia proper, and that in of itself is a specific act, right? Then when they talk about specific actions, that is an indicator that is going to happen, as opposed to making more vague claims or even broadly speaking, vague claims. Which brings us, for example, this conversation on Tavush. Let's put aside the whole discourse on the delimitation process, limitation, et cetera, et cetera, purely from the lens of this analytics, right? If, for example, Aliyev had made through back channels, right, the specific threat that if X, Y, and Z villages are not included part of the delineation process or whatever, we're just being hypothetical here, right? That would qualify as a very specific threat. But if he
But we
makes the
don't know
claim,
that
for
he said
example,
that.
we don't know that. I'm giving an example, right? Uh,
Okay.
but for example, if he makes the general claim, the delineation process has to be within the interest of Azerbaijan. If we don't get what we want, we'll force our way through. That is a more vague threat. It's still a threat, but I'm trying to explain the specificity component in being able to qualify the high propensity for violence from him.
Okay, I understand that. And perhaps this is not part of the conversation or part of what you were saying, but it's interesting to me. And I've been thinking about this, I mean, not only myself, many of us. When Prime Minister Pashinyan went to Davush to meet with the residents of those border villages that were going to be impacted by the demarcation process, which, they were hailing as something that was very important for hopefully peace down the line, Pashinyan himself said that if we do not return these 4 abandoned villages, by the end of the week, Azerbaijan will attack.
Right. So again, we are not privy to the specificity of these back channel conversations, right? But as the third variable in our matrix addresses, that is the notion of the venue of the threat, whether it was done in private or in public. And so private threats have their own dynamic, public threats have their own dynamic. But within that context, before we get to that, right, threat specificity is the issue at hand. So in the private venue, right, assuming that the modality of threat was made privately and there was a specific threat made, within the threat matrix, it would qualify as a high risk propensity outcome. And that sense, the probability, again, assuming that was the case, right, the probability of Aliyev using force is much, much higher. So whether the PM was expressing something that was actually the case or not, we don't know. We're not privy to that back channel discourse. But if it was, it would fit the model that we're talking about.
If it was, and at this point, we don't know.
Right.
Okay, that's a conversation for another time. But getting back to the matrix, as you called it. So we talked about specificity. So we understand that in this case, Aliyev, when he's very specific in his threats, then the propensity increases for actual invasion,
Correct.
attack, or whatever it is. But if he's more vague and general terms, absurd, and he also does it for his own domestic audience as well, right? To
Definitely.
make that's also an important thing. The next variable here is threat severity. What do you mean by threat severity? I mean, isn't any threats? Yeah.
Right. So in the scholarship on this, right, after threat specificity, we pay attention to threat severity. And threat severity pertains to the type or magnitude of action that the coercive act threatens. So specific action would be, I want this. If this doesn't happen, there's going to be consequences, right? A specific threat. Severity entails the magnitude of the action that is being threatened, right? So saying something along the lines of, if I don't get what I want, I will take out your military positions, or I will basically shell these village areas, or I will do an incursion and occupy these given villages. That's one magnitude. Another magnitude would be, if I don't get what I want, I will invade and take Yerevan, so you better listen to me, right? So we see that, and what the literature shows is that when it comes to threat severity, to the threat severity variable, if a threat is disproportionate, relatively speaking, it lacks credibility. If it is proportionate, then it does have a credibility and therefore induces the propensity of action being taken, right? So in that context, if, for example, Aliyev said, going back to the Zangezur example, if I don't get what I want by the end of this year, okay, my positions are going to allow me to do a two-pronged approach and secure what I want. Therefore, Armenia, heed to my threats, right? Heed to my warnings, because I will be able to utilize my positions, my forces to secure a corridor. That is a proportionate claim. But if he said, for example, if you don't give me the Zangar corridor, I may have to go and take over all of your Sunik. That is a disproportionate threat. It doesn't mean that might not be his intention, but in the matrix of within this matrix of being able to qualify behavior and then quantify, right, the probability of the type of behavior, threat severity is gauged with respect to proportional threat and a disproportional severity. And this is kind of what I mean, what the concept entails when we measure risk propensity and threat severity.
Okay, so we look at the specificity, then we look at the severity of the threat. And coming back, because you mentioned it, obviously, is the venue of the threat. So whether it's public, whether it's private, through back channels, is it for a domestic audience? Is it, to put more pressure on, Moscow or Brussels or Washington or whatever the case may be? So the venue is also as important here.
Correct. So just to make a note, right, all these are interconnected. No variable stands out on its own,
Mhm.
and no variable could predict anything, right? This is why they're all sort of intervening variables. So the venue is important in being able to qualify the construction of the threat, because research shows that it's context specific. And let me explain to you why. So, if there's a private threat, in a private threat, the coercive actor has the leeway to back out or not implement it, pending on international pressure or changing developments. But if there is a public threat, right, if the public threat has made, there's an audience cost. And what this means is that the coercive actor cannot really back off if the coercive actor has made a specific threat, if the coercive actor has given a severity of threat, and if the coercive actor has made this threat public. That means backing off will make the actor look weak domestically, and therefore there's an audience cost. In this context, then, whether a threat is made publicly or privately is important in gauging the risk propensity involved. And so when we observe these developments, right, research generally shows that public threats tend to enhance risk credibility, coercive credibility, because most of the coercive actors who happen to be authoritarian figures cannot be coming off as weak or backtracking from their domestic audience. Whereas if they do make threats privately, they have the leeway to back out because there is no audience cost. So when we qualify these observations, right, the venue becomes important when we view it through the lens of specificity and vagueness, and through the lens of proportionate and disproportionate severity. And therein lies the importance of the venue, whether it's public or private. And to come back to the examples that we spoke of, right? Has Aliyev, for example, made specific, severe, and private threats with respect to the so-called Zangezur corridor? We don't know. But if he had, that would change the dynamic. Has he made specific, severe, and public claims on Zangezur? He hasn't. Therein lies a distinction able to qualify the risk propensity. And the same would apply in the private discourse. So we use these variables to be able to better understand the level of credibility and the extent to which whether an imminent threat to an invasion or to an attack exists, or whether the propensity is relatively lower. And that, of course, remains intrinsically important because having this capacity allows Armenia to potentially mitigate, deter, or at least have sufficient information to counteract Azerbaijan's objectives, as opposed to being completely off guard or engaging in sheer speculation without any quantifiable or observable thing patterns.
But I'm just going to come back to the private versus public argument for a second, returning back to Davos, because this is something that's obviously, very present at the moment. If Aliyev had privately or through back channels informed Armenia's leadership that if they did not do this, if they did not agree to the demarcation process and the return of these four villages, then he would, I don't know, launch an attack or whatever threats he made. Is that not more dangerous or more concerning than any public statements he's making? Putting his domestic audience aside for a
Okay,
second.
right. This is, like I said, it's context specific, right? So in this instance, Aliyev chose, if that is the case, right?
Mhm.
Aliyev would have chosen the private venue, right, fused with specificity and severity to get his point across. And the fact that if all of these variables remain consistent, then he would have attacked. Now, the modality of attack, okay, and the severity, we don't know. Okay, or his threat may not have been, for example, the use of force, hypothetically, but the complete collapse of the delimitation and negotiation process, which then later on he could have used to justify a broader incursion. So we don't know what the specificity of the threat is. When we say specificity of threat, we don't always mean the direct use of force. It could be different types, right? And when we talk about severity, we don't know what level of severity. We're just trying to qualify it. So in the confluence of these variables, if all of those attributes, characteristics of threat, severity, and private venue aligned, then clearly the probability of action would have been quite high. Now, why, for example, would he have selected a private venue of threatening as opposed to a public one? And there are obviously various explanations for this in the literature. One is international pressure, right? So hypothetically, if he had made this threat publicly and there was immense international backlash, and he was forced to, for example, somewhat minimize his rhetoric or his actions, there might have been audience costs for him. So in that context, and we've talked about this, right? We've written about this. Aliyev is a very rational actor. So in his cost-benefit analysis, he understood that it is safer for him to engage in a private threat than in a public threat because of specific audience costs.
I want to come back to what you were saying, Nerses, but I do want to continue on and look at the fourth variable, which is threat justification in the matrix. Can you explain that for us, please?
Well, correct. So threat justification is a new variable that has been introduced in the scholarship in the sort of developing this threat matrix. And what threat justification does is it allows us to better understand the effect and the construction of the threat credibility. And so threat justification, in more simple terms, we understand this by basically posing the following question, right? How do coercive actors frame their threats? And the persuasive arguments they utilize to legitimize, right? To legitimize the basis upon which the threats are built and justified. So if we look at the broader literature, right, the sophistication, magnitude, and quality of the threat justification is very important in understanding the threat credibility. And so when Aliyev, for example, develops these very, relatively speaking, complex, multi-tiered arguments and justifications, you can see that they have put in a lot of resources, a lot of time in justifying their threat. That indicates, right, in alliance with the other three variables we've qualified, the propensity for action. But if a threat lacks a sufficient level of justification, it is simply thrown out there, right? That suggests a diminished propensity. So in this context, right, we're able to qualify in the matrix the risk propensity by observing the modality and complexity of the threat justification. And and I say sort of explain in the report, there are 5 general types of justifications that are utilized by coercive actors to qualify the legitimacy of their threats. The most obvious one is national security, right? And this is the claim that there's an imminent threat to the collective security of the country or a pending one, therefore action has to be taken. So Aliyev used this extensively until the 2020 war, right? And then there's the second type of justification is regime survival, right? We know that when authoritarian regimes anticipate or face domestic political turmoil or instability, they utilize the whole external enemy, the external conflict to divert attention. So in this context, if we see, for example, drop in oil prices, social unrest in Azerbaijan, and in sort of correlation with that, Aliyev begins constructing threats against Armenia out of the blue, or unexpectedly, this aligns with this type of threat justification. The third is preemptive measures, right? And Aliyev has been using this extensively since the post-2020 war. He's realized that the national security argument doesn't work because Armenia does not pose a threat and nobody's buying that argument. His regime survival is not at stake, right? Aliyev is pretty much a god in Azerbaijan. It's become a full authoritarian structure. So he tends to use the preemptive measure thing argument, right? And this basically justifies a threat by saying Azerbaijan reserves the right to take coercive measures, and these are designed to prevent Armenia from attempting to attack Azerbaijan or to engage in quote-unquote revanchism, right? So we've seen Aliyev utilize a lot of the preemptive measure threat justification. And again, the magnitude and sophistication of this, right, along with the other variables, allows us to understand the risk propensity. The fourth one is the notion known as reputational justification. And this is where a coercive actor invokes a notion of national prestige, dignity, honor as the basis for their threats and their behavior. Aliyev utilized this, for example, prior to the 2020 war, talking about the honor of the Azerbaijani people and the humiliation they had suffered, and therefore they had sufficient basis and justification to attack Armenia. Reputational justification is never used by itself. It is used in conjunction with the other modalities of threat justification, but it is one that is sort of always under the radar, but it's consistently there. And finally, of course, threat justifications that are specific to domestic audience costs. And this pertains to issues where there are expectations in domestic politics that coercive measures will be utilized, in which case the coercive actor would justify their threats by basically saying, my people want this. If I don't get what I want, then I would have to take action. Research shows that national security, preemptive measures, and regime survival tend to be the more severe forms of threat justification, while reputational justification and domestic audience costs, in relative terms, tend to be the least credible justifications for using force.
You've basically laid it out, and we understand this. My question to you is, after the 2020 war, where Azerbaijan was victorious, after the total ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the restoration of, the honor and everything of Azerbaijan, if we look at it from that from that perspective, how do you explain Aliyev's ongoing, continuous, unending threats against Armenia?
Well, this is why the report starts off by basically giving an explanation of what constitutes deterring behavior and what constitutes compellence behavior. And so we've written extensively and spoken extensively, even introduced the whole discourse on hybrid warfare, kinetic energy, kinetic diplomacy, coercive diplomacy, asymmetrical warfare. So all of those are toolkit strategies and objectives of the Aliyev regime, right? So in that context, understanding all of that and having a framework of a threat metrics that could quantify variables and understand it will be able to engage the threat level and specificity level as far as Azerbaijan goes. But the question of why he does what he does, and then tying that in with threat propensity is very, very straightforward. It's an act of a collective and overarching act of compellence, right? So if Aliyev's objective, the Aliyev regime's objective is conflict persistence, if the Aliyev regime's objective is not only maximizing its demands and maintaining that maximalist posture, but also utilizing that to reduce Armenia to some form of a vassal, right, or a perpetually weak state there's endless asymmetry from the lens of Azerbaijan, then clearly all of its demeanor aligns with that kind of behavior. The objective of this report was for us to be able to gauge, understand, mitigate, and deter that behavior. So we know why Azerbaijan does what it does. The question is, how can we stop it? Or how can we limit its effect, its threat against us? And therein lies the confluence. But in more simple terms, to understand Azerbaijan's behavior, right, this is the behavior of compellence, where they are going to try to compel Armenia to acquiesce. And you counteract compellent behavior through deterrence. And so if Armenia has a healthy and a robust threat matrix and understanding of this compellence, it can develop the capacity, the mechanisms of deterring those types of acts or that type of behavior.
But see, this is viewed from the general population as an act of weakness on behalf of Armenia when it's continually in deterring Azerbaijan and acquiescing constantly. Do you
Deterrence is
see
not
what
acquiescence. Armenia has not been able to deter Azerbaijan. Therein lies the problem.
Okay, how does it deter Azerbaijan?
Precisely through the mechanisms that we're talking about. And so when you're talking about, for example, entire security apparatus, entire security infrastructure that lacks the capacity to deter cyber attacks, to deter hybrid warfare, to be able to address asymmetrical issues, to not be able to quantify and understand the threat propensity posed by Azerbaijan, you're not going to be able to engage in deterrence. And this is a byproduct of, as we've talked about extensively, weak security institutions that was inherited from the Russo-Soviet model, right? The limitations in capacity, the lack of hard power capabilities, and the asymmetry. So within the confluence of all of that, Azerbaijan, of course, is going to utilize every instrument it has to force Armenia to acquiesce. And so when we talk about deterrence in this context, the only deterrence that we've been able to engage in has been the diplomatization of our security and reliance on foreign partners, right, the international community, to curtail Azerbaijan's behavior. Any other form of deterrence, Armenia has not had the capacity. So when you look at the lack of security studies in the country, when you look at the lack of dehybridization capabilities, when you look at state institutions that lack resilience capabilities, all of those have contributed to the situation. And this isn't a criticism. These things cannot happen in a vacuum. They have to be developed through extensive processes. We've never had these processes. So when we qualify through that lens, there's the politicized approach to security, and then there's the sort of empirical hard security factors, okay? So when we look at through that lens, how is Armenia deterring? Armenia has tried to deter with the limited instruments that it has. So far, so good. Why does it have limited instruments? And this is what we're talking about right now. And what security studies and this matrix and the discourse that we're having does is it allows Armenia to enhance and improve the instruments that we don't have. Is that a silver bullet? Of course not. But at least it enhances deterrence capabilities. And as we proceed with this process, we are going to get incrementally stronger. But we're not going to be able to be at the level where we could speak to Aliyev on equal terms until we ascertain the full resilience, hard power capacities, and close the asymmetrical gap. But what a threat matrix does is it at least allows you to slowly close that gap by being able to deter Azerbaijan and be able to understand the risks and the level of risks and the specificity of risks that is coming from them.
Nerses, you talked about the diplomatization of security that Armenia was able to, on some level, get diversify its, let's say, partnerships or relationships with the West specifically. And yet that did not deter Azerbaijan from ethnically cleansing Artsakh.
That's a very good question. But then, of course, when we talk about the subject matter, I think we're framing the question honestly as Armenians, but dishonestly as members of the international community. And the international community has forever said Artsakh is not part of Armenia. Okay.
But the international community also said that they would not allow ethnic cleansing
Absolutely.
to happen.
Absolutely.
And yet they did. And yet they did.
Because the geopoliticization of Armenia's security is specific to Armenia proper, as those who are deterring Azerbaijan from the lens of the international community. So the diplomatization of security and deterring Azerbaijani attacks against Armenia is separate from what Azerbaijan did to Nagorno-Karabakh. And what happened in Artsakh, what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh is a complete and fundamental failure of the international community. But there are two things that we have to be honest about, and we are diverting from the subject matter at hand, but I'll be happy to address it. The international community wanted to be done with the Artsakh issue, okay? Whether we like it or not, that has become an obvious fact. And so their objective was not to have genocide, not to have any percent of the population of the 120,000 indigenous ethnic Armenians being killed. As long as the population wasn't massacred, that territory for the international community means nothing. And so from their lens, the population wasn't massacred, and that which belongs to Azerbaijan from their perspective was addressed. Is it absurd? Is it insulting? Of course it is. But guess what? Weak states suffer when they lack the capacity to address problems that powerful states consider to be on their agenda. And Azerbaijan was able to strengthen itself in the last 20 years to achieve what he did. And Armenia perpetually became a weak actor, a vassal that was not able to address its security issues. So what we're doing is we're complaining and saying, Why were we not, as a vassal, as a satellite, able to engage in this game, okay, and not get what we want? And the international community turns around and says, I'm sorry, you made your bed, now sleep in it. And now we're suffering for it. Okay, that is a reality. I hate to say it, I say we all suffer for it. But that is the nature of the beast. Now, how do you confront that beast? By becoming stronger. Okay? We can sit down and complain. And so the Artsakh issue, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, right, is a unmitigatable, unexcusable black eye, a stain on the international community. Okay? But that is a specific phenomenon when we're talking about the territorial sovereignty and the protection of the Republic of Armenia. And the failures of the international community is specific to Nagorno-Karabakh. But when we talk about diplomatizing security to protect the Republic of Armenia post-2022, after the German invasion, that is a different dynamic.
Nerses, I think we're going to have many opportunities to keep talking about this, because let me play devil's advocate a little bit here and say, why is Armenia so important for the international community that when, I'm not saying if, when Azerbaijan decides to force our hand again, or when it tries to invade again, what guarantees do we have that the diplomatization of our security, getting more international support for the Republic of Armenia is really going to hold any water at that point?
Of course, you don't have any securities. I think there's a flaw in Armenian thinking when you do this whole
Okay.
either or paradigm, right? Is there a guarantee or there isn't a guarantee? No, we have to look at the magnitude of the guarantees, right? What is the sort of in a continuum, right? To what extent can we anticipate international support, and to what extent there might not be there? So the savior complex of is there going to be a guarantee from some actor that's going to kind of save us? Of course there isn't. There are only guarantees to develop an independent security capabilities, which we haven't done since 1996, and we're paying a price for it. So in that context, there cannot be a dependence on the international community. But what we can do is we can instrumentalize the diplomatization of security, right, to deter Azerbaijan for a certain period of time until we develop our independent and hard power deterrence capabilities. This is the whole conversation at hand. So to address your question in this context, if Azerbaijan decides to invade Armenia, the question isn't if it could or it cannot. The question is, have we, to some extent, developed sufficient costs to Azerbaijan that through their risk-benefit analysis, they would defer or deter themselves from engaging in that behavior because the cost would be too much in relation to the gains. So this is the framework that we're looking at. And the role of the international community or the international actors that are involved in this process can mitigate that. But of course, there are no guarantees, which kind of goes back to the initial question you posed, right? Why is Armenia important to the international community? Well, until the Western pivot, it was not, because no Russian vessel, no Russian satellite is important to the international community. That's a fact. Okay? But now that you're becoming an independent actor in a very important region, right? A strategically important region. Now that you're engaging in independent foreign policy and you can engage in relations with diverse set of actors where you can develop alignment of interests, the dynamic changes. So whereas in the past, no Western actor could have had an alignment of interest with you, therefore you're of no relevance to them. Now, a multiplicity of actors view you as a potential partner in a multiplicity of issues, not simply security. And that obviously enhances your relevance. Now, the magnitude of relevance is a different subject of conversation. But nonetheless, right, there's a multiplier effect here when we look at diversification and segmentation of important sectors and issues.
I promise this is going to be my last question because we've already gone over what we usually do. The reason we started these security briefings was so that we could understand not only the security situation, but understand it from scholarship, from research, data analysis, and instead of just sort of blowing steam whenever we're through our emotions and sometimes irrational expectations. This particular threat matrix that you've sort of mapped out, right? The specificity of the threat, the severity of the threat, the venue, and the threat justification. You're saying that it's based on scholarship, on recent research. Now, as an authoritarian figure, we know that Aliyev can be unpredictable. as most authoritarians can be. Is there a playbook that authoritarian figures use that we can apply these variables to? Or is it just, yet another sort of framework in our, I don't want to say desperation, in our attempt to mitigate and deter?
Of course, there's a playbook, but it's not a singular playbook. It's sort of a broad combination of the diverse and complex playbooks that you bring together and you discern and you decipher and you understand the behavior of authoritarians, right? We're not the first one that have dealt with this. The problem is we don't have advanced analytical schools in Armenia. We don't have advanced security studies in Armenia. Thus, we engage in speculation, we engage in spurious relationships, and we engage in innuendo and opinion. But of course there is. How did the United States, for example, deal with the Soviet Union, for 40, 50 years post-World War II with their containment policy? There's a whole school of scholarship on this, right? How do different small democracies like Sweden, like Finland, like the Baltics, right, develop their comprehensive state security and resiliency strategies by utilizing this so-called playbook? So of course there is, but the issue is there is no copy and paste. You have to take that scholarship, you have to take that expertise, you have to take that learning, and then you have to produce your own school of security studies and apply that to your specific situation. So our problem, generally speaking, right, is lack of information, lack of capability when it comes to understanding these things. And generally, that means we tend to be quite ignorant in the demeanor of our antagonistic actor, and more so in an inability to predict Aliyev's behavior. Aliyev can be unpredictable. Most authoritarian regimes are unpredictable. But the secret is to be able to predict some of that unpredictable behavior. And there's a science to this. This is the point that I'm trying to get at, right? There's a science to being able to understand behavior, risk, and action. Obviously, this isn't like physics or the hard sciences, but in the game of probability, right? When you quantify these things, it at least gives you a healthy understanding where you could develop options and contingencies to these types of unpredictable and dangerous behavior.
Well, thank you, Nerses, for illuminating a little bit more about Aliyev's behavior and the importance for us to understand, mitigate, and deter it.
Always happy to do so.